Thank you very much for having me. I'd like to thank the organizers for having me here. It's great to be back in Hong Kong and Asia. It's an honor to be after Steve and right before the great Dr. Lake and Dr. Lake died. And so I'm going to talk about technological colonialism, and I'll explain what that is. And at the end, I'll tell you a little bit about my fund, and I'll make an announcement about my fund. So let's jump in. Maybe. The clicker's not working. There we go. It's working now. And so let's just talk quickly about the AI revolution. Steve talked a little bit about this, but this has been going on. It didn't just happen in November of 2022. This has been going on since the mid-50s. The AI revolution happened. It evolved through cycles since the early 50s of winters, springs, and summers, where AI was going. We were going to do great things with it. Then it went out of favor. It came back into favor, and it went out of favor. So we were doing great research. We weren't doing any. And then we started doing some really good things with it again. We developed some really good capabilities in the early 2000s, leading into the mid-2000s, 2010s, we started to really get value from machine learning, if you categorize machine learning as AI. And that's when we started seeing the advent of cloud. So machine learning is really just statistics with when you can really retrain it. And then in 2017 is when we saw the birth of what we're seeing today with ChatGPT and these generative pre-trained models that you're seeing. And that was really where we're seeing this acceleration of AI as we get into this new type of technology. Now, if I knew what Steve was going to talk about, I would have done a different presentation where I countered everything that he talked about. Because I'm very skeptical of this current technology. I think we need different technologies. And that's part of why I started this fund. But we can talk about that some other time. And so what do I mean by technological colonialism? And what are the underpinning drivers of it? And so if you look back to any type of colonialism, there's really what drives that is when there's a technological imbalance between societies. And if you go back to the late 18th century, what you saw between Europe and the rest of the world was that Europe invented three major things that that had technological superiority in three major technologies in total. They had ships, they had cannons, and guns. Now, some parts of the world may have had one or two of these things, but there was no part of the world that had technology of all three of these things that were equal. And so Europe was able to colonize, specifically four parts of Europe, was able to go out and spread their religion, their language, and their culture throughout the world. And what's the result of this? The result of this is that despite the fact that colonial countries, so think England, France, Spain, and Portugal, despite the fact that today they represent only 4% of the world's population, their religion, Christianity, makes up 31% of the world's population, and their languages, so those four languages are 4 of the top 10 languages spoken in the world. Right? That's crazy. That's because of something that happened 300 years ago, less than 300 years ago. That's the result of a technological imbalance. So what does that have to do today? Before I jump to that, let's kind of lay the groundwork. The groundwork before ChatGPT, before this new technology came into place. And this is a really important launching point for ChatGPT and any kind of pre-trained AI. So pre-trained means there's data that's being based into it. The groundwork of this is that at that point when these models were being trained, there was this huge digital divide, meaning that there were massive parts of the world that did not have really good connectivity to the internet. And by massive parts of the world, think, at that point, the second most populous country in the world, India, the vast majority of it, outside Delhi, Bangalore, and a couple other parts, were not connected to the internet. So the second most populous country in the world did not have did not have connectivity to the internet. What does this mean? This means their data is not represented on the internet. That means their language, their culture, their perspectives, which is their data, is not in the internet. Africa, South America, other parts of ASEAN are not represented on the internet. Additionally, until a few weeks ago, China was not very well represented in the data in these models. Okay? So now, where are we today with technology? And why is that important? So Steve talked a little bit about why it's important. So when these models are trained, what happened was, and what Steve kind of glossed over is, what OpenAI and others did was they went around the internet and they stole off all the data off the internet. They went and they scraped all the data off the internet. That means they sucked all the data, and if your data is not in there, it's not represented in the models. Okay? So that foundation, I forgot to mention it, that foundation. And so now, the analogy I have is we have, what are the technological shifts? The technological shifts are computing, the infrastructure. So in two parts of the world, and we're going to include China in this now, in two parts of the world, and really Beijing and Singapore, we have computing power, digital infrastructure, and cloud computing. And really, we have a bunch of white dudes and Chinese dudes in hoodies, and throwing a few Indian dudes in there, developing these models in Beijing and Silicon Valley. That's primarily where these models are being built, with a limited supply of computing power. And then we all know there's a whole geopolitical aspect that I'll get into in a second. And then we have the guns. So now we have data that are the technological guns, and data is an incredibly important critical resource, because without it, if you don't have enough, you can't train these models. Now, Steve mentioned that you can generate data from it. You can use generative AI to generate data, but you need these pre-trained models to begin with to use them to generate data. And so if you don't have the base, you can't generate the data, and you can't generate cultural perspectives. Okay? The other is you have these global disparities. So you don't have the data very well represented from vast parts of the world. Again, you have a bunch of white dudes in Silicon Valley, a bunch of Chinese dudes in Beijing. You do have some models being developed in the Middle East, but it's primarily Chinese dudes in hoodies and white dudes in hoodies and a few Indian dudes in hoodies. Okay? And then you have a collection of practices. Really what this means is you have some tech companies and governments that are deploying data, they're collecting data, so they're just scraping data off the internet. They're violating a lot of privacy policies to just scrape data. Now, there are nations that are starting to employ sovereignty laws and things like that to counteract this. And then finally, we have the cannons. And this is where we start getting into geographical concentration. So I've alluded to this, where we're starting to see a concentration of power we're starting to see a massive concentration of resources, of compute, of talent, of algorithms, and this is through political means, through other means. We're starting to see corporate control. We've already got a virtual oligopoly being formed, right? There's really 3 companies that are controlling the vast majority of these resources today. We're starting to see a few cracks in that with the open source movement. But really, that creates this whole winner-take-all dynamic where we're in this risk of getting just a very small perspective of what's going on in the world and a few companies controlling this very important and powerful technology, where if you want to participate in this revolution that Steve talked to and Lake's going to talk about after I get off, what you can really do with this technology, you need to adopt these perspectives of these companies and of these white dudes, Chinese dudes, and Indian dudes in hoodies. And we're already starting to see the trend emerge. The colonial countries, the US and China, represent the 2 most used AI systems. 3 countries, or 3 companies, represent more than 90% market share. 3 countries represent, and I'm underestimating here, more than 75% of the world's talent supply. China, the US, and India represent greater than 75% of the talent supply chain. And this is a massive underrepresentation. Now, I mentioned there's cultural bias, so we're seeing English domination. This was until a few weeks ago. DeepSeek was a great thing because it dragged this whole Chinese perspective into a model that was on par. Alibaba came quickly with their Huan model. And so it's great that we're seeing this whole different cultural perspective come out. Next week or the week after, we're going to see a model come out of Falcon 3 come out of the Technology Innovation Institute in the UAE. This model is going to have an Arabic perspective. That's great. So we're still starting to see this whole Western or Chinese perspective, which then yields this context challenge. If you have a cultural perspective, you don't understand context. Culture drives context. Bias context. Bias in the West is different than bias in other parts of the world. And there's some parts of the world, like Europe, that are trying to mandate, through regulation, that these providers control bias in these models. That means if you want to use a model that's being used in Europe, you're going to have to adopt a European definition of bias. That makes no sense. Facial recognition failures. There's not a whole lot of black people in this part of the world. Why are you going to make a model worse in this part of the world because you're controlling for something that doesn't exist here? Because when you control for things like bias, you actually have to make the model worse. Translation errors, content moderation issues, these are all issues. There's economic implications of it and things like that. I'm running a little long, so I'm going to jump through here. Sorry. I do want to talk about this. So we have export controls. So we know about the export controls in the US. This is resulting in limited access to foundation models. It's also resulting in bottlenecks in advanced computing and technology transfer bans. Now, there's a couple of things going on in the startup community around this that we're hoping will drive policies that will allow this. There are technological solutions that will be able to underpin treaties that will allow visibility and control that are actually better than bans. And so we're hoping that will remove these bans that we're seeing. And there's some really good responses to this. So there's some really good things you can do. So what am I doing? One thing I do is I set up this fund. We're investing in different things like precision AI systems, edge computing, quantum integration, AI safety and governance. And we're even trying to democratize access to venture funds. And how are we doing this? By lowering the bar to investment and making it easier. And today we're announcing this, it just went out this morning, by being able to directly invest through crypto in an AI fund. This is the first AI fund in the world to allow this. It's an early stage venture fund. And if you want to do this, you can just email us. And if you want to learn more about AI investing, about deep tech AI, you can read my newsletter. Comes out every week, Silicon Sands News. I thank you very much for your time, and enjoy Hong Kong.